Hi. Oh yeah, you can all hear me. Hi, well, welcome. Welcome to the last day of ISCRAM. So I hope that you've all had a really good time. For me, it's gone really, really quickly. You know, you seem to arrive on a Saturday or a Sunday, and you think, I've got loads of time, and then it's gone. Okay, so here we are on the last day. I hope that you've had a chance to catch up with old friends and colleagues, and also to make some new ones. So today, we have our last keynote speaker, and I'm absolutely honored to welcome Monika Buscher. So her work is probably well known to you all. So a little bit about Monika. So Monika is a professor of sociology at Lancaster University in the UK. She's the academic lead for the UK ESRC, Social Research Impact Accelerator account at Lancaster University. And she leads on many, many research projects. So research on social practices of mobility and risk governance, the Is IT Ethical project, the SEC in Core project, the Bridge project, which is probably known to a lot of you. Monika also initiated the platform Is IT Ethical, and that develops guidance for digital ethics and responsible innovation and collaboration with the Public Safety Communications Europe network. Monika also has, in addition to being a professor of sociology at Lancaster University, she also received an honorary doctorate from Roskilde University in Denmark for her work, which many of you will know, on participatory design. Okay, so I would really like you to welcome Monika here. It's going to be a great talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Julie. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so I am absolutely honored to be here and delighted to be here to discuss my research with you. As the panel on Monday said, the ISCRAM community challenges you, but also changes your life, and that's really happened for me. I came for the first time in 2007, and I've been probably to 8 or 9. I haven't really missed many, and I've really enjoyed it, so I'm really delighted to have your attention. The theme of this year's conference is individual-centric emergency management systems and intelligent context processing. That's clearly inspired by personalized services in other domains, personalized advertising, personalized healthcare, mobility services, you name it. And that's an inspiration, but also problematic and a challenging move for the design of intelligent systems for crisis response and management. And many of us are doing it. I'm a sociologist designer of such systems, but also of the organizational practices of disaster risk governance. And preparing this keynote has been an opportunity to reflect on what it means and what it could mean to make IT personal. There are 4 or 5 key forms of personalization: push, opportunistic, imposed, and personal, if you will, and risk personalization. The first 4 are all designed to enable people to understand that they are at risk and to inspire them, to guide them to take action, ideally as instructed. And let's see some examples. Luba Mancheva, Carol Adam, and Julie Dugdale, for example, designed their multi-agency modeling and visualization tool inspired by an analysis of what happened to the victims of the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria, Australia. And they cite data about the causes of death, why people died, And 14% of the victims died while escaping, but 69% died actually trying to shelter in their houses. They were caught in their houses. And 58% had made no preparations either to their properties or to themselves. And so what Julie and her colleagues are doing could improve warnings sent to people in disaster situations. And this is an example of the kind of messages that people are trying to design for this purpose. It's a personalized message for households at risk of bushfires, developed by Kao et al. And you have to set this against the general mainstream audio or text messages that people are getting at the moment. And maps like this and more detailed models like Julie's and her colleagues are a massive improvement. They show the fire, so you've got the fire here and you see the area of the fire that's contained, and then the dotted line shows where the active fire edge is. You've got the wind direction, and then you've got instructions for what people should do, very clear instructions saying, put your bushfire plan into action. Your safest option is to leave immediately. And that's exactly what people want. Commenting on the present state of emergency warnings, the interviewees that Kao et al. Worked with said, what we get now is far too general. What I'm thinking in that situation is, what's happening to me now? What's happening to my house? And then they showed people these kind of prototypes of messages. And what they say about this kind of warning is, oh, what I see here is 0 to 4 hours, so I've got everything ready to go. My wife and my daughter have fled. It's really just me deciding to leave. So when I look at this map, I can see my escape routes. There are 3 routes I can take. I will probably wait until I'm told that the fire is an hour away and then make a decision, because an hour gives me a lot of time. Or then he gets a bit unsure and says, oh, I don't know. I have to admit, when it comes down to only 1 hour away, how do I decide it's worth staying or not? So this is not quite what people who are designing these kind of personal messages are thinking. It's not really quite what they intended. And we'll get a little bit more into that in a moment. So these are push warnings to known locations and known households, but people are actually often on the move. So there we can use the call detail records and that mobile providers, at least in some countries, have an obligation to share, enabling geofenced warnings to just the people in a particular neighborhood. For example, you've got Rotterdam Harbour here, and you can see the census gives you that kind of data of the kind of people who are in that area. But when you use the call detail records, you see that there are actually more people. It might be tourists, it might be visitors, we don't know. But you can actually geofence and directly send messages to those kind of people in that area. Or in the case of an Ebola outbreak, call detail records can be combined with disease case data and allow calculation of the potential spread of the disease. So for the person on the street in Rotterdam, it might feel like you have a siren in your pocket, perhaps then followed up with personalized maps and instructions to find shelter from chemical contamination, go somewhere inside, shut the windows. For the person having just traveled away from an Ebola outbreak source location, it might actually translate into an obligation to register and to be monitored for disease symptoms. So these are 3 different screenshots, 3 different projects where personalized monitoring prototypes have been built for Ebola diagnosis for people. So if the previous examples opportunistically exploited personal data like location to enable personalized warnings, this example uses it to impose personalized services on potential victims of disease. Now, a fourth form of personalization can be thought of as personal, where personal devices such as this heat guard armband can be used to warn individuals at risk of heat stroke. Now, these are all very interesting and useful, intelligent, individual-centric emergency management systems, and they utilize context very intelligently. But they forget or pay too little attention to the fact that this kind of innovation is embedded in a wider context. So making IT personal is actually disruptive innovation. When we are making systems that can provide people with just-in-time personalized warnings, we can inspire social innovation. And so far, the examples that I've shown you are really focused on paternalistic personalization. And in a way, I'm talking, you know I'm being provocative, I hope. I'm talking to the converted in a way. ISCRAM is quite different. We take a different approach. We're quite exceptional in this. But this kind of paternalistic personalization is quite dominant and quite problematic. In a policy paper on lessons learned from Australian wildfires, Michael Eburn reflects on the effects of personalized warnings. He argues that it implements a form of over-promising, where what people hear from such warnings is a guarantee, almost. I will receive a personalized message to tell me exactly what to do in my circumstances right now in regard to this fire. And he says, I know that's not what the fire services or the government agencies are saying, but I listen to emergency calls on bushfire hotlines, and they're very much, should I be increasing my insurance on the shed? And should I let the horses into the top paddock? So people come to really rely on those kind of messages. So what I would like to juxtapose that with is the idea that actually personalization is something that we need to do and that people need to do, and that the personalized IT system are meant to support, which is the personalization of risk, so that people understand that they are at risk and are informed to take action. So it's more about making IT and making personalization more disruptive. And this is what I would like to challenge us with, to think about how we can support a really broad-based, rich understanding of risk. But not just the risk, but also the responsibilities. Why are we at risk? And the responsibilities, the capacities to respond, what we can do about it. And that can be much more than instructions to evacuate or flee. This is all happening, and we all know this, under conditions of austerity. So in the UK, since the financial crisis, the funding for emergency services has dropped by about 40%. That's absolutely massive, really debilitating. And it's not just the emergency agencies, it's also the infrastructures behind it, so the monitoring of fire safety. And this has led, in part, to the Grenfell disaster, where a fire killed 80 people in one of the richest boroughs in London. So what I really would like us to discuss is how can we find a conceptual shift from the kind of paternalistic ideas of personalization to participatory personalization, for radically reflexive resilience. And I call it reflexive because people are learning that they are actually embedded in the risks that we live through. And it's radical because it really inspires collaborative approaches to respond to those risks. Okay, so what I've shown so far is how we've got disruptive, how the innovation that we are doing is disruptive. Now, why does it matter? It matters because we are here. We have 11 years now to really do something about climate change. You see this is a creative visualization of the different kinds of trajectories that could ensue if we don't address this challenge. And climate change has already an effect on the intensification and the increased frequency of disasters. So people are arguing that we are actually living through a 21st century of disasters. And we know why also. We have a growing and aging population. We have growing urbanization where building often takes place on the slopes, deforestation, and on the coast flats where rising sea levels will affect people. And these effects are highly unequal globally, but also within cities. We have situations like here in Rio where you have a favela directly next door to luxury high-rise buildings, where the people living here, in case of a mud slide, will be far more affected than the people next door. And these kind of inequalities are what generate risks. Climate change is not just a threat amplifier, it's also generating new problems where many of the people will not be able to live where they lived before and will be on the move as we are hit by more disasters. So in 2016, the 10 largest displacements were climate-related. And the figures at the moment, we don't really understand what is going to happen around this. The figures are vastly divergent from 200 million people displaced to 1 billion people potentially displaced by 2050. And we know this, and we know why too. These are 5 of my favorite books, with Charles Perrow arguing that we are building highly complex systems where accidents like the Boeing plane crashes, they are not freak things that happen. They are normal accidents. They are inevitable. They will always happen. Where Ulrich Beck argues that we are living in a risk society, that our societies are built around risks. Sheila Yazanov shows how long-term and political disasters can be around the Bhopal disaster. Jared Diamond analyzes the Easter Islands collapse and also the differences between Haiti and Puerto Rico and their different environmental strategies that affected their resilience in the Haiti earthquake. He argues that humanity is on the verge of collapse and that societies often enter this collapse at the height of sophistication. So in resonance with studies that are coming out now about biodiversity loss and climate change, this is a real danger. And also, of course, studies that show that the risks we experience are not acts of God. They are not just happening to us. They are highly social and political. So why people are struck by disasters is very much stratified by poverty and wealth and by where people live and what they are able to do. So we know all this. So we kind of know that precarity is the condition of our time. And yet, really, we are still trying to build technologies that try to calculate the incalculable. I really find that difficult to understand why we are focusing our efforts on this. Sheila Yazanov calls these kinds of technologies technologies of hubris because they lead us into calculating the incalculable and also into trusting that we can actually control disasters. But what if the time was ripe for sensing precarity, and we were inspired to develop innovation around this? That's what I would like us to think about. So I really want to talk about how this is already happening. This is happening within ISCRAM, and this is why I am so delighted to be part of this community, but it's also happening elsewhere, and everyday people, ordinary people are doing it. So I'd like to just show you a few examples, some are shorter than others, of such transformations that are already happening that we can take as inspiration. So this is a story told by Stephen Haggerich from the British Red Cross at a public safety communications conference. He'd just come back from the island of Lesbos, and a woman he met there showed him her mobile phone, and what happened to her was, on the other side, she was asked to steer a boat across the Mediterranean. She'd never done anything like that before, but she agreed to do it, and they were fine until they got right up to the island, and the seas were rough, and she didn't know where to land the boat, and it was quite a dangerous situation. So what did she do? She sent a WhatsApp picture of her location to a friend in the States who had done the same journey, and they sent back, and you can't hardly see it, but it's a red line, an instruction for where to land the boat. And that's what they did, and they survived. And what I think we can conceptualize that as is a new kind of sense of awareness and addressability. People are developing in the way they are appropriating and building technologies into their embodied experience of situations, a way of discovering ways of finding a way around difficult situations. And Nigel Thrift talks about this in terms of a very commercialized LifeWorld.inc, but it can also be a very positive new sensory capacity that we have. These are Elenia, Katya, and Karina. Do you have a hunch where they might be? Anybody? Jose?
Maybe somewhere in the east of Europe?
Yeah? Sorry? Romania? No, not quite. They are in Chernobyl. They've moved back to the exclusion zone in Chernobyl. They are poor. They have no easy way of making a livelihood, so they moved back there. And this is a table from Adriana Petroina's book, Life Exposed, about the particles released and their half-lives. And what you see is that some of them actually were gone within hours. Others stayed for days, now also gone. But some of them stay for thousands of years. And in fact, we can conceptualize that as an infinite duration in terms of human lifetimes. So she says that the table gives a sense of the virtual infinite incubation period of Chernobyl-related illnesses. So some of the radiation can kill or affect you by radiation, just by walking past it, others by ingesting it. So Elena, Katya, and Karina grow their food there, they eat it, so their life expectancy will be affected. And the story of Chernobyl is quite interesting. When it first happened, the Soviet Union was responsible for the response effort. And they asked people who were affected by it to come to Moscow to a hospital to have their radiation levels monitored and measured, which then categorized them as either in need of compensation and support or not. You can imagine that not many people made the journey from Chernobyl to Moscow or were able to make the journey to have that measurement taken. So when Belarus took over the responsibility for some of it, and of course I'm simplifying the story, one of the things they did was install a mobile measurement unit. So they took these vans into the villages around Chernobyl and invited people to come to the village hall and to be measured. And that, as you may imagine, hugely increased the number of people who were entitled and categorized as in need and entitled to support. However, when they did that, they found that it was impossible to deal with the demand. So they took away the mobile measurement unit, they increased the thresholds for the categorizations, and in her article on how this all unfolded, Olga Kuczynskaya argued that radiation was made twice, even thrice invisible. First by, it's invisible, full stop, we can't see radiation, but then it was made invisible through the thresholds and through the mechanisms of measuring who is affected and how. And that is highly political, so those kind of measurements and those kind of practices are highly political and define the risk. And she talks about alignment as a concept for us to think about how we can design ways of developing technologies for us to understand the risks. So she talks about how thresholds and standards have to be designed in a way, or should be designed with in mind what can be measured and what should be measured, and also involve the constant work of monitoring the relationship between what can be measured and what should be measured. I'll give you another example of this moving on a few years from Fukushima. The image that you see here is a school debate. What happened in Fukushima was in March, before the disaster, the threshold for dangerous radiation was 1 millisievert per year. After the disaster, there was an attempt to raise the threshold to 20 millisievert per year. There was outrage. People were very concerned about it, and there were situations like this. And I'm going to show you a short video to give you a sense of the feelings around it. And it was shot by Ian Ash, a British filmmaker who happened to be there. And you hear his voice. Listen to what he's saying when the video starts.
なんか昨日は一気に200倍ぐらい跳ね上がってるんですよね、ベクレル落ちた放射能ネットが東京で。僕たちはがんになりませんっていうのは報奨できますか？ごめんなさい。ごめんなさいは足りない。はっきり言ってください。言えない。確率論だから。絶対ということは誰も言えない。絶対安心ということは誰も言えない。しかし安心してくださいとお願いできる。ここは大事です。命令もできなければ 100% という科学はありません。必ずエラーが起こります。
So you can really feel the anguish that people experienced on both sides. And you saw in the last shot that there was then a measurement program that was instated. What happened, and again I'm really simplifying the story, The official sources, the government made available a map like this, where you have these concentric circles of how radiation spreads and where it's dangerous and where it isn't, or where it's less. And people didn't believe it. And Yuko made a poster about how important trust in information is. So people did something about it. They, supported by the Safecast citizen science initiative, people built their own map. They bought Geiger counters. They even built Geiger counters and measured what the radiation was where they are. And you can see in the map that the picture is much more complex, where you have intermixed areas of high and low level radiation, and also in the higher ground you have more radiation than you see on the map. So this is an example how people are developing their skills and their experience of being augmented by technologies into ways of living with risk differently. And this is slightly complicated. I am a social sociologist, so I'm drawing on Bruno Latour's work to understand what's going on there. And he uses the word articulation to get a better understanding of what's happening there. And he has this example from a completely different context, how perfumists learn to distinguish different smells. And what you see there is a kit for perfumists, where you've got, on the one end, you've got really sweet smells, on the other, you've got something really floral. And the difference between those smells is vast in terms of their chemicals. And over the course of the week, the perfumists, the trainee perfumists, work their way inwards on that kit, learning to distinguish ever more subtle differences between the smells. And in the process, they learn to articulate with language how to describe those smells. But they also, and Latour argues, it is not just about the language, it's actually a physiological change that's happening with them, where their noses become able to distinguish things that they couldn't distinguish before. And he uses the fact that in English, articulation is used not just around language, but also we talk about an articulated lorry, where the joints are put together in a way that makes it a very agile and movable thing. So he talks about how the smells, the chemicals of the smells, are articulated in our noses in ways that are different, that make us physiologically different. And so I'm kind of arguing, I'm thinking that the capacity to have your own Geiger counter and to make your own map makes us physiologically and also conceptually, mentally able to understand risk differently. And in Fukushima, you can see how this actually changed how people framed the risk and the disaster. So rather than just think about that a scientist and public authority person as responsible to tell them the truth, when he argued that actually it's very difficult. The science can't tell us everything. They also started to think about how their consumption of energy actually makes nuclear power station necessary in Japan. And one of the conclusions that the community in Fukushima drew is to enact a policy of 100% renewable energy. This is different from the national Japan energy policy. So they've actually translated their new awareness of risk into action. And so Sheila Yazanov argues that there really is a need for technologies of humility, and she thinks of these as technologies not just as in digital IT technologies, but also social technologies and organizational technologies. And they should be focused on framing vulnerability, distribution, and learning. Just to sort of give a sense of what she means by that, when she talks about framing, We need to ask who's affected, where, and not just where, but also when. What about future generations of, in Bhopal, people are still affected by what happened there, and climate change is another example. Who's missing from our picture? And in one of the presentations that I attended, Zhao from, I can't remember which university he was from, but he showed how prioritizing emergency response based on social media analysis actually it can exclude communities. For example, the community his grandmother lives in, she's 96, she doesn't use social media. So if you're prioritizing emergency response by looking at the messages and cries for help that people send on social media, you might be missing a whole community. In terms of vulnerability, we need to understand better and design tools like Julie's map of how the fires affect us. How vulnerable are we? How are we vulnerable? How do we get to be this vulnerable? Who is we? Who are we missing from that? And how can we make ourselves less vulnerable? In terms of the distribution, we need to ask who's bearing the risks, but also whose responsibility are the risks that people are experiencing. And learning, how can we build technologies that support learning from past disasters and other situations, and also from the modeling that we're trying to do. So one really lovely book that gives really good methodologies around that is Matthias Gross's book on ignorance and surprise, which acknowledges that we are ignorant, we cannot calculate the incalculability of disasters. And what we need to do is develop ways of generating as many surprises as possible so that we put ourselves in a position to be able to anticipate and rehearse how to respond to as much complexity as possible. So what I've shown you is some examples of transformations that are already happening, which really put this idea of paternalistic personalization into doubt and inspire us, hopefully, to stop focusing on those kind of possibilities and focus more on the seed practices that we can see in those transformations and support those, develop innovations that support those practices in terms of participatory personalization. That I'm not saying let's just get rid of all the good modeling and the good control-oriented innovation that we are doing. It's a way of complementing it and shifting it and combining it with more community approaches and people's practices of making sense of disasters, which also should entail an acknowledging of responsibility and enabling us to take more responsibility. One thing that I think becomes very visible from this also is how our capacity to respond is absolutely dwarfed by the need and the things we would have to do to live safely. The demand for response is much higher than the capacity we have. And kind of what I think is the blue bits on this slide represent hope, because I think if we really put our elbow grease into it and focus innovation around that, we can actually really achieve something on sensing precarity that will make a big difference. The red side of it, I think, speaks for something that should inspire us to panic. And I will just show you a short clip. I'm sure most of you will have seen it, where I'm not the only one to express that.
Adults keep saying, we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as if you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if the house was on fire, because it is.
So this was Greta Thunberg at Davos speaking to all the big politicians, leaders of our economies and societies. What do we do about this? So I'd just like to summarize, really. I think it is harder and harder to ignore that precarity is the condition of our time, and we are developing new ways of sensing that precarity. What we need to develop is a sense of responsibility and a sense of responsibility. What can we do about it? And then do something about it and use, for example, Gross's work on building more surprises into our ways of learning about disasters. Because it really matters. We don't have much time, and it really needs to be done. Climate change is really also exacerbating crises and generating new ones, including a loss of staggering loss of biodiversity and antimicrobial resistance and air pollution. This is a picture of aerosols generated by wildfires, dust storms, and the salts in the sea, which contribute to air pollution. So what you see in these pictures is a mixture of fast onset and slow motion disasters, and I think in ISCRAM we haven't paid enough attention to the slow motion disasters and how they interact with the disasters that we live in. So what I would like to ask us to do, and what I'm working on, is to support a shift from paternalism to participation through concepts like addressability, awareness, alignment, articulation, humility, the framing of disasters, understanding of vulnerability, the distribution, and ways of learning about it through paying more attention to surprises. And the kinds of things that we do at Lancaster, this is from the Bridge project, we do participatory design, we build prototypes, for examples of systems that can draw in lots of different data and make sense of it. We build collaborative information spaces, often through participatory design with prototypes, but also creative methods of modeling and engaging stakeholders. This is a technical picture of the kinds of collaborative information spaces that we make. Like Julie said, we work on the ethical use of data and how we can do responsible research and innovation with information technology. This is the Is It Ethical platform where you can find guidance. This is a video which I'm not going to play of the platform.
The game is a way to slow down.
And it's an 11-minute video of the platform, but
particularly when I'm working with partner agencies who perhaps don't know particularly well, don't know their own protocols. So how much I can share with them about an incident is tricky, and I have to think that through.
It was fun, so that's fine. Friends are getting more.
We developed games and different ways of carrying out creative ethical impact assessment as part of innovation projects. And so this is where I'd like to end, really, to call for the ISCRAM community to put effort and your creativity and your commitment and your knowledge into the construction of participatory personalization and radically resilient futures. And that's it. Thank you very much. And I'd really appreciate questions, comments, experiences, suggestions. Yuko, yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm fascinated by your presentations. And I have a question. Probably it's very important for us to inform ordinary people about how to learn the risks. But according to the disaster psychology, if the risk is too much, it's very hard for one to accept it irrationally. So what happens is people try to avoid from learning the real risk. So people try to persuade themselves, oh, this is just nothing, you know. They try to escape from the fact. So is there any good way to convey the truth or true risk to those people who would like to escape?
That's a really good point, and I think the example around Fukushima is actually a brilliant example, because as people were measuring and they're still doing it, they're monitoring and they're putting sensors up, they actually educate themselves about what the risks are and what to do about it, and it can be the extreme decision to go 100% renewable, but it also shows how some forms of radiation are not so harmful, so you can live with them. It's okay, and I think, in my mind, it's important to not just make sensible the risks, but also the responsibilities and the responsibilities. So to share information about, around the Bhopal example, for example, who was actually responsible, and where do you call the boundaries of responsibility? And there are groups really campaigning for making that more visible. And this kind of work can help them use formal representations and build ways of measuring it to argue that case more strongly. And then to educate ourselves about what we can do about it. Yeah, thank you.
This was a really great experience listening to you, because we all sense that it was not only about personalization and making it personal for others, but it was very personal from you. Mm-hmm. There are very important things that you are mentioning here, and it's a grand vision. How can we move towards that's the difficult issue, because it is an appeal that requires not only emotional incitement, but also understanding. The only, if I would offer a suggestion, is that Sophie Pieleman, she's not here, she has left here to live here. Yeah. She has done a very interesting study of how sparsely populated areas address risk. Because they are sparsely populated, people depend on each other. There are long distances to services, medical services, whatever. So people live in a constant situation where they know they depend on each other. And in her study, she argues that in sparsely populated areas, of which you have a lot in Sweden, you have also in Norway and Finland, then the conditions of the living is something like an emergency in a heavily populated area. And her work, which I don't think it has been further elaborated, perhaps because there was no funding, I think it's very worth studying, because she has conceptualized the factors that are so important in such situation. Maybe that's a thing to consider.
Thank you very much, Jose. I was sat next to Sophie at dinner, actually. One thought it gives me is that within ISCRAM we are also, you know, we're a global, but we're quite sparsely populated and distributed across the globe. And we could really do with platforms and infrastructures to help us exchange. We could use the ISCRAM community to actually share more of our research and work together in a more continued fashion in between the conferences.
Thanks for your captivating talk.
Yeah.
Just about the responsibility, I think it's a matter of culture as well, because in Australia it's a sparsely populated area, and people feel very concerned with the bushfire risk and their own responsibility, because firefighters can't obviously be everywhere.
Yeah.
So they know they have to deal with it and they can defend their own homes. And in France or in other countries, when there's a wildfires, people expect firefighters to deal with it, and they don't feel responsible at all. So I guess it's a matter of education very much.
It is, and it's also an opportunity for building technologies that enable a dialogue. So that's exactly what I mean by a more participatory approach. So, you know, if we acknowledge that people are taking responsibility and are able to do that, then how can we support them rather than just send them a paternalistic evacuate now message? And how can we, and then, you know, that raises all sorts of issues about what are the emergency services actually responsible for? Can they be held to account if people then die in a wildfire? Or does this have to be a more societal understanding of how we live with more of those? Yeah, thank you.
So thank you. It's one of these talks where you're sort of being reminded again. That's good to start the morning with. But one of the things that crossed my mind when you were talking about personalization, we can sort of be hopeful and positive and say, oh, we can make something better if we personalize it. But what about the flip side of that? So if something's not personalized, I can share whatever I have with someone else. But if we personalize it, I can no longer help someone by giving my resources because they're personalized to me. So could you comment on sort of the other side of making everything personalized?
I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean, because you're not, I think there are these...
Simple example, I keep losing my conference program. It's not personalized, so there's no problem. I can just get a new one or ask someone, can I look at your program? If it was highly personalized with my preferences and my things, I could no longer do it. If I lost it, I'm in trouble.
I see. So, you know, if something happened now and we got personalized evacuation instructions, I would probably get a different route than you because I'm not as fast as you was, you know, depending on disabilities or things like that. So then you're not sharing anymore. Not the same understanding of the events, for example. Yes, but there is also this other side of personalization, of trying to really understand what's going on, and not just having information tailored to you, but also taking the responsibility for understanding the evacuation routes and the fact that people might get different understanding, and then act in a way that follows those instructions and not me following you, which would be, so have a deeper understanding of both the risks and the efforts that emergency and technology developers are making to help, but also the broader framing of, you know, how did we get there? So.
Yeah, so then it's probably more about agency and ownership of your own, or maybe responsibility again, of being in control of that personalization. So not just saying, we've made it personal for you, but we've made it so that you can make it personal for you, or something like that.
Yeah.
Just come in there as well. I think that's a really good point, because for me it's not like an either-or situation. It's personalised or it's not personalised. I think it's a complementary thing. So you have personalised things, but it doesn't stop the broader approach. So for example, with the evacuation, you know, I have the knowledge of the personalisation aspect, but I also have a general knowledge to fall back on as well. Maybe that was...
As long as I don't over-rely on that personalized version.
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. It was very inspiring. Lina Ramsell from Linköping University, supervisor Sophie Pilleman, like Jose mentioned. And I was thinking about our project that Jose mentioned, because there were a lot of users that were retired or was not common to technology. Yeah. They didn't have a high technology maturity. Just to download an application was too difficult for them when we were trying to test and to have involving them in our research. So I think you touched upon it a little bit, but just connecting it to personalize it for the user. Is it possible for you to elaborate on that a little bit further? How you think about that? How do we involve all kind of users, all kind of different type of personalities, and the technology maturity, and how complex could the technology become? Is it for everybody, or is it only for people and users who have a certain of technology level? Because here it's very common that we, in our research, look at people who have quite high technology maturity. For example, digital volunteers, they can use social media without any problem at all, and they can also almost develop their own applications, and so, as you mentioned. Thank you so much for the talk.
Yeah, thank you. Really good points as well. My mom is 91, and I am so grateful to FaceTime and the iPhone for being thumb recognition opening and intuitive, so easy to use, because it means I can see her. And I think we do need to design in that way, but I also think, and it's quite contradictory, we need to design completely the other way, and also people need to take much more responsibility to develop the technological maturity or digital literacy that Jennifer was talking about yesterday. Because to really understand the potential, the nuclear potential of digital technology to transform our capacities, people need to understand it a lot more. And for example, we talked about artificial intelligence yesterday at the table, and how it needs to be white boxed and people need to be able to understand it. Nobody understands it anymore, because we have designed it in a way that is completely opaque and very complex. So that raises some questions in how, should we really make technologies that we can't understand, and how can we design technologies in a way that we can understand them, which might be the opposite of making it intuitive and black boxing it. But it has to be that ordinary people have to take more responsibility in understanding what technologies can do and how to use them. So it has to be all those things. Thank you so much after such a lovely evening last night to be here at 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm really impressed, and yeah, thank you for your questions, and thank you for having me. It's been really very useful to do this.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.